Good evening and a very warm welcome to First Issues. Botswana is a very youthful country with children aged 0 to 17 years of age accounting for an astounding 41% of the population. The economic future of this country literally rests in the hands of its youth. This is a fact recognized by government, as evident in the language of the National Youth Policy, which acknowledges the challenge to develop comprehensive intervention strategies and programs to mitigate risks facing the youth, such as alcohol and substance abuse, and related threats such as violence, HIV infections, road fatalities, and deteriorating moral standards. This demographic is particularly susceptible to these risks despite significant factors such as economic welfare, educational and social backgrounds, because at this stage in human development, the particular part of the brain responsible for complex reasoning and executive function, the prefrontal cortex, is not fully developed. The very reason that age restrictions are placed on activities such as voting, drinking, driving and military activity until the late teens or early 20s. In the United States, where driver licenses are given out at the age of 16, car accidents are the leading cause of death for teenagers, and they in turn are responsible for 1 in 3 accidents on the road, although they only account for 14% of that population. According to our guest this evening, there is a major reorganization occurring within a person's brain during their teenage years. A life event that those responsible for guiding a young person at this stage should be knowledgeable about to effectively teach, mentor and protect our future leaders. An internal reconstruction that results in behaviors such as tantrums, withdrawal, a seeking out of reference groups, taking the car without permission maybe, sneaking out, a general lack of appreciation of consequences that we have come to identify with teenagers. Get comfortable as occupational therapist Frida Brambert-Deawada breaks down in depth the internal goings-on within the adolescent brain. Important viewing for policymakers, teachers and parents alike. Welcome back to the show as we delve into the inner workings of the adolescent brain. To help those tasked with teaching and nurturing them better understand how to do so effectively. We asked Frida why she thinks it is important for authority figures to understand these neurological goings-on.
Well, I think understanding the brain generally and how it develops explains a lot of the behaviors that we see in different stages of a child's life. So in some of the previous episodes we touched on the early brain, 0 to about 10, 11, and why all those connections and wiring of the brain is so important. And it gets us to understand why children behave in a certain way in a certain period in their life. Sometimes it's linked to hormonal changes, sometimes it's linked to growth spurts. There's a lot of different things happening in the brain. As a teenager, we see a lot of different behaviors, and as occupational therapists, we sometimes get parents or teachers asking us a lot of questions about, this child is not organized, why is he talking back to us, how can we discipline him? And I think the foundation there is because they're coming up with a lot of questions because there's not really that understanding of what actually is going on inside that child and where they are at in their developmental stages. So your child might be 12, 13 or even 17, but brain-wise, they're not fully matured. They're still children. They're still going through developmental stages. So I think to understand behaviors that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis at school, at home, it's important to see what's happening from a neurological perspective.
So what is going down? Break it down for us if you can.
Basically, you can split up the brain development into 3 different stages as we go through life. So the initial stages between 0 and about 10, 11, you'd call that the pre-adolescent brain. And then from about 11 to 19, going on to 23, you'd call that the adolescent brain, that's the teenage brain. And then from 23 onwards, you'd refer to it as the adult brain. And what happens is what we're doing by learning is we're building connections in our brain. So an infant and a toddler, at that stage, there's a huge amount of growth that take place. There's like tens of thousands of neurons and connections being made per second and per minute. And only when the child reaches teenagehood at about 11, 12 is when a similar growth spurt happens again. And so between 0 and about 11, there's a lot of pathways that are being made and being reconnected and getting child through basic primary, getting them ready to learn and so on. But then what happens is that they reach 11, 12 and suddenly all that was put in place is still there, but it's now being totally muddled up. It's being reconstructed completely.
How does this reconstruction manifest itself when one now transitions from the pre-adolescent brain to the adolescent one? The changes are not only a challenge to the teen, but can be quite the adjustment for parents.
So you get a 12, 13-year-old child looking clumsy, disorganized, being more impulsive. Suddenly they're taking all these risks. They want to look cool, be there. You know, there's like all these behaviors that suddenly appear again, which are quite similar to what we see in toddlerhood. You know, they whine, they scream, they want their way. There's a lot of risk-taking behavior. They're not quite sure about the consequences. It's like right now, right here, and that's it. So they're reacting very impulsively. And when you notice that, it's a big change to parents, and suddenly there's this shift, like, oh my goodness, what's happening? In boys and girls, you see a lot of physical growth happening, and it doesn't always connect with their behavior. So you're seeing this tall child who might only be 13 or 14, and you get parents starting to treat them as little adults, and yet they're still such immature creatures in their brain, trying to develop different parts of their brain. And yeah, that takes a lot of years, to the point where you're actually going from a very primitive brain into a middle part of the brain into a higher level of a brain. So basically you can again split the brain up into 3 different sections. And the wiring, the connections that need to build all of that together and build pathways from one area of your brain to another is basically what we need to look into.
Speaking of the 3 parts of the brain and looking into that, could you please unpack that for us and help us understand how it manifests really, these processes?
We've got a lot of different areas in our brain that have different functions, but I'll make it really simple and I'll just split them up into 3 simple sections. The first part being the basic spinal cord connection to your brain. So it's the base of your brain, and this is where teenage years spend most of their energy and time, because this is the most active part in teenage years. It's the brain that helps us to survive. If we're hot, we need to cool down. If we're hungry, we need to eat. If we're thirsty, we need to drink. So it's really about survival, and it's a lot about taking risks or trying to figure out whether something is threatening or not. How do you react? So they're very strong emotions, aggressiveness, anger management. There's a lot of emotions that take place there, but it's really the brain that helps us basically survive. And because this is the main active part in teenage years, a child needs to feel secure, and a child needs to have a sense of belonging when they come home. So safety and security is extremely important for this part of the brain to be allowed to be. So what you find is, for example, a child might say to you, "I hate you," and slam the door and bang the door and whatever. That's a momentary reaction or response to a certain incident. Often when you then talk to the child afterwards, they can reflect and say, "Oh yeah, that might have not been the most clever thing to do," but in the heat of the moment, it was that impulse, it was that reaction, and that's how they responded. So again, as the environment, as adults around, we actually need to be the prefrontal cortex, the higher level part of that brain for that child at that moment. So we need to act in a calm manner, we need to listen to them, we need to stay extremely connected with our teenagers on a day-to-day basis about all the things that are happening in their lives, to allow them to go through that period and to understand that we understand why they're trying to take risks. We're understanding why he's reacting in an impulsive way, because this is the main part of the brain at that stage that is actually being relied on, so to say.
Welcome back to the show as we delve into the inner workings of the adolescent brain. To help those tasked with teaching and nurturing them better understand how to do so effectively. According to our guest this evening, there is a major reorganization occurring within a person's brain during their teenage years. A life event that those responsible for guiding a young person at this stage should be knowledgeable about to effectively teach, mentor, and protect our future leaders. Having described the basic primal lower part of the brain that is most active in a teenager, fueling knee-jerk reactions over more contemplated decision-making, our guest next details what is needed for a teenager to better develop their access to first the emotional and then the reasoning empathetic brain.
When you're moving up a bit, you get the middle part of the brain, which is the emotional brain. And, you know, teenagers are extremely sensitive, very vulnerable. They hear, see everything in passing, in not passing. They pick up on body language, on cues, and, you know, there's that sensitivity in them that, again, it's important to be aware of. They need a strong sense of feeling worth and worthy. They need a strong sense of belonging to either a peer group or having their family unit to fall back on and to have them, make them feel worthy as well. Because without that, and without a safe, secure base, it's very difficult for them to move on to the higher reasoning brain, where basically you'd come to your third part of the brain, which is the highest, the CEO of your brain, basically, where you've got the time management, the logical thoughts, you know, is this right, is this wrong? Your conscious takes place in a higher level part as well. It's where you start being able to put yourself in another person's position and thinking, oh yeah, this person might be feeling like this or this because of X, Y, and Z. How could I help? So it's the empathy that grows as well. It's where your working memory is stored. So for strong connections and neural pathways to take place and to develop from your base to your frontal lobe, it's extremely important for a child to be emotionally happy and stable in those teenage years and to feel understood, to feel connected.
What could be the consequences or results of not effectively supporting a teenager during this time?
If they're not, they tend to stay for a longer time in that basic primitive brain. And as adults, if you're not going to have an environment to show them the right you know, to be a correct role model or to discuss things with them, it's going to be quite a challenging road for some of them, as well as parents, teachers, and so on, to deal with them. But if you stay connected, yet allowing that child to go out there, form their identity, develop their independence, as well as holding their hand lightly but steadily. So it's really about being there for that child, no matter what, and trying to acknowledge what they're going through. And yeah, so in a nutshell, those are the three basic. So you've got your basic brain, your middle brain, which is the emotional side, and then your CEO of your brain, which is the higher level functioning, which usually only falls in place really when you're like 23, 24, where you can make decisions, where you can manage your time, where you can organize yourself, where you can make where you can prioritize different events. It's not easy. And a lot of times there's a lot of pressure on these children because they get into Form 1, Form 2, and they're expected to be organized and to have everything in place. And, you know, even at home, there's a lot of pressure often put on the children and it just does not correlate to what is actually happening internally.
Welcome back to the show as we delve into the inner workings of the adolescent brain. Does gender come into play when we speak about the internal processes of a teenage brain?
Yeah, gender is definitely, the brain develops slightly differently in girls and boys, and therefore the approaches, for example, in teaching, could also differ between the two. So boys in teenage years, for example, because they're physically so much stronger and taller and bigger from a physical perspective, they need a lot of sport, they need a lot of movement, because they have got this testosterone raging through their body, and movement is one of the ways to help that settle and calm down. Boys also need challenges and competition, as well as very hands-on, practical type of tasks and activities, whether it's in a classroom, but even at home. Often they're very visual, they need to see things to make sense of things. Their language side of their brain is slightly less developed than girls in that respect. So girls, on the other hand, they love discussing things. They want to be part of a peer group where they're emotionally accepted the way they are. They need to feel unique and special. They need to feel, you know, have that sense of being able to discuss and communicate. Whereas boys often just want to get on with something and do something, whereas girls can often just sit and talk and talk and talk. So there is some differences in that respect. But again, at some stage, at about Form 3, 4 level, it all kind of balances out, and all the different parts of the brain in girls as well as boys that were not as strongly developed as they were growing up through primary kind of all level out, and they all come out to be quite.
Having taken all of this into account, we do acknowledge that although similar, not all teenagers are the same. In Frida's expert opinion, what makes one teenager more inclined to indulge in negative activities and another not so inclined?
Well, I think there's a whole lot of factors. We shouldn't only look at brain development, but I suppose we also need to look at genetics, at the environment, at the background, at the culture. In terms of where did this child come from, how did he grow up, who were significant people in his life or her life as they went through their early childhood. Because of course a lot of these early childhood experiences also play a big role in terms of how you respond or act out and behave in certain things when you are now reaching your teenage years and you're trying to experiment and so on. So I suppose it does make a big difference in the type of environment and what kind of role models the child had or has in his life, and how open you are to stay connected and communicate with your child, and how present you are but not enforcing and not putting too much pressure on the child. So it's finding that balance of letting go but at the same time being connected. So even teenagers, just like young kids, they're still very much in need of boundaries. They love structure, they still need structure. So if you stick to certain basic rules within your home environment, it provides that security. So they know that, okay, at home, this and this is considered, you know, acceptable or not acceptable. And they need to know that if you're beyond that, if there's non-acceptable behavior, and you need to identify that with the teenager, there are consequences to your behavior. So yes, you can go to the party on Saturday, but there's a time to come back home. And yes, you might, you know, we all are aware that you're going through a huge amount of hormonal changes. And saying that, I think a teenage boy is like times 10 testosterone in his body going through at that point. So they're suddenly experiencing all these different emotions and feelings and things that they previously did not have. So again, it's getting used to that, and how do you go about it? And being aware that all these hormonal changes that are happening also influence the biological clock. So, you know, your child in primary might have been used to going to bed at 7 and waking up in time, and that's the way it was. But suddenly, we might still want the child to go to bed on time, but their biological clock has changed, and therefore you have teenagers that tend to stay up later, which is a normal reaction. But yet our school system here starts like at 7 o'clock in the morning, so they still have to get up early. So what do you get by the end of a school week? An exhausted teenager, because they can't get themselves to sleep early enough to get to the 9 to 10 hours of sleep that they require. And saying that when a child is sleeping, it's when the processing in your brain takes place. So whatever you learn during the day, it's just put there as little marks, but those markers are processed and wired at night when you're sleeping. So we're dealing with a sleep-deprived generation of teenagers right now, which also then influences everything else around that.
For parents and teachers, what I'm getting from our discussion is that you would like more of an appreciation of the fact that they may look like young adults, but they aren't really yet, and maybe for a lowering of expectations. What words of advice do you have for authority figures?
Like I said, it's finding that balance of holding on to a child but letting go at the same time. So I think one of the most difficult things for parents at times is to let go. But if you're holding on lightly and yet you're there steadily part of that child's life, so it's the connection you're keeping, it's not the forceful, constant, you're doing this wrong and why are you behaving like this type of, because that's when a teenager might close up and think, well, I'm not going to talk about this, this is not the person to talk to, and they'll find other means to actually get what they need or what they think they need to thrive in their day-to-day life.
And for the teenager?
I think be who you are, stand up for what you believe. Yes, be friends, but choose your friends carefully. And don't be scared to have that difference in a mindset if at all you're doubting something. And find a role model, whether it's mom or dad or uncle or teacher. Find someone that you can connect with as an adult and that you can ask advice when you're stuck with something. Don't be scared to voice what you're actually experiencing. And there's a lot of people out there that you might not trust or not get along with, but at the same time there might be that one or two people that you do, and try and seek help when you feel you need help or when you need advice or when you are not sure about something.
We end our discussion here this evening, but pick it up again next week when we ask the burning questions regarding the most constructive way to then discipline adolescents, the common mistakes authority figures make in relating to teens, and whether or not corporal punishment is approved by those from our guest's profession. We trust you will be back. Until then, I, Namitsa Samagula, the team behind First Issues, and our sponsors, First National Bank, wish you a good night and pleasant viewing.